Howdy, friends. This is Matthew Sewell, and you're listening to episode 109 of the Popecast, A History of the Papacy, the only podcast about popes where you'll find non-boring stories on the successors of St. Peter and a reminder that all the world's problems have happened plenty of times before, so you can stop stressing out about the state of the world. We've been there. We survived. Some people didn't. But you know, the world's thy ship and not thy home, as St. Therese says. But today we got a particularly unique guest, and easily it's one of my favorite conversations. I think maybe just like period, let alone being a great conversation for the show. So Michael Lentz is an expert on the Normans and the creator of Memory Medieval on Substack, YouTube, and X, formerly known as Twitter. I put a link to all of his stuff in the description. He also mentions a few books at the end of the show, so those are linked below as well to learn more on the Normans. I'm certainly going to get a couple, if not all the ones that he recommended. But he joined me to tell the story of the 11th century Battle of Civitate, in which the Italian Normans fought the Pope's armies. It was a influential battle. We get into all that. We get into the historical context, the lead up to the conflict. But we also talked about a lot of other stuff, the Norman influence on Western civilization in the decades and centuries that followed. We talked a bit about the First Crusade, and even teased out how the Norman efforts, specifically the Italian Normans, have had a ripple effect into our present day, most specifically in a particular event that happened in Rome just after Easter of this year. So stay tuned for all that. A quick note before we get into it. If you're watching this on YouTube, please be sure to subscribe to the Popecast channel and leave a comment after listening to let us know what you liked most about the episode. Also, while the Popecast is free, of course, to listen to and watch, it does take time and effort to produce. And I have huge plans for where the show will be taken in the coming weeks and months. First and foremost, making my background a little bit more interesting than just a white wall here. So if you feel called to monetarily support the work we do here at the Popecast and at Today in Papal History, our newsletter, you can do so over at popes.substack.com by becoming a paying subscriber for as little as $6 a month or $60 a year. So thanks in advance. Thanks for listening and for watching. Now, without further ado, here's our conversation with Michael. Welcome back to the Popecast. We're here with Michael Lentz of Memory Medieval. Michael, thanks for joining the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I think we've been, are we mutual followers? I don't know. I know I've been following you for quite some time. And I always appreciate your content on, I still call it Twitter. Everybody probably still calls it Twitter, on X, formerly known as Twitter. But I always appreciate a fellow history nerd. I feel like it's kind of coming into a new renaissance. Forgive the pun, but it's nice that it seems to be more and more of an interest in learning from the past, because it helps us to stay sane in the present. But we're going to talk specifically about the Battle of Civitate. I feel like I can't get my head around calling it using the CH sound. But at any rate, it's a Norman battle featuring the armies of one of my favorite popes, someone who's covered on the show before, Pope St. Leo IX. He was unfortunately, I understand, in the losing party in this. We'll get into all of that, but first, just a little bit of background. I'd love to know more of how you got into medieval history, this interest of yours, and where all that started, and then how that manifests in your writing and podcasting and tweeting.
So I think I've always really been into medieval history. There's sort of that meme that when you're 6 years old, you kind of have to pick between a samurai and a cowboy and a knight and whatever is the other one. And I just picked the knight. Medieval history has always really resonated with me. Very early, like the Disney Robin Hood was one of my favorite Disney movies growing up. Getting into my teens, Howard Pyle's Robin Hood was one of my favorite books, and any sort of medieval related fantasy type of thing, like Terry Brooks's Sword of Shannara, however you say that. I've always just really resonated, I think, with knights and sort of the virtues of chivalry and the stories of the heroes and things like that. So growing up, that was kind of very much a part of things that I enjoyed. And it's kind of, as an adult, you get busy, you do things, this, that, and the other. But more recently, it's come back because when we were having our first son, we didn't really have any established family names. And so I started looking into coming up with a name, figuring out a good name for my son. And so I started looking at various periods of history, and the medieval period really just struck me again, getting back into the history and going online. And there's all kinds of new resources to really go back into the history. And there's various YouTube channels that have deep dives on various figures and all of this sorts of thing. And so I sort of got restruck again by medieval history. And that sort of has relaunched my enthusiasm for medieval history and my interest in revitalizing it, I suppose you could say.
Okay, interesting. So then it's more specifically, well, actually, I'm curious, what were like kind of the top 5 name candidates once you started looking into characters from medieval history? You don't have to tell me what you picked, but.
Well, so I could go into this quite a bit because
Hey, we got time.
I really went deep on the names, and it occurred to me in the process of coming up with a name that it's, I believe, important for young men to have a name that they know the story of. I think that's very formative for them growing up. And so I wanted my son to have a name that would, of a historical figure that would have virtues that I would want him to emulate, essentially. And, sort of, I don't know if spirit animal is not the right word, but like that sort of concept, like you sort of have that idea.
Almost.
I'm sorry?
It's like a patronage almost.
Yeah. And as a young man, I remember as a young man thinking like, Michael, I wonder who else is famous as named Michael? Who else has the name Michael? And, you come up with Michael Jordan, Michael Gretzky, but historically there wasn't a lot of Michaels. That there's obviously Archangel Michael, but that's sort of not relatable. So I also, in choosing a name, I wanted to pick, I wanted to have a group of names because I didn't want, if I have, you can't give one son you can't name one son like Richard and then name the other son Timmy or something like that. Like you can't,
Right.
That's just like unfair. So I needed a sort of a group of names to choose from that were sort of on equal footing.
Mm-hmm.
So that way, if we have multiple sons, which we do now, and I sort of have already basic names to, you can't go with whatever. You can't call your one son Julius Caesar and then again, call the other guy
Right.
Steve. So, so I settled on the First Crusade. So both of my sons have names of notable crusaders, and then
Right.
any future sons will also follow suit.
Interesting. That's great. I don't know that I've heard anyone settle on children's names from that specific period, but as someone who is firmly under the belief that the Crusades are massively misunderstood, and were, very virtuous, and I'm sure we could talk a ton about that too.
Well, and the other thing I was thinking at the time too is that if I'm not giving my sons a family name, then I should give them historical names where maybe if they have sort of a similar story, if you will, from where their names come from, then perhaps that'll inspire them to work together when they're adults. That was kind of my,
At least giving them somewhat of a head start, because there'll be even in maybe good natured scrapping and fighting too, that helps them move along the right track. We were kind of in the same boat, because I also have multiple sons, and our naming convention has been the 4 popes who are known as the Great. So I guess medieval names for me as well. So it's Leo, Gregory, Nicholas, and John Paul II is the latest one. But so if we have another boy, one guess what that'll be. But I love that, right? Because family names are great. If there are family names, excellent. We try to kind of work those in even still, but it seems like something that's lacking in society. Nothing against people who I don't know, name their kid Braxton or whatever, but made up names just seem to pale in comparison to a Richard the Lionheart or a William the Conqueror or something like that.
Well, and that's sort of my spicy take is I think if you make up a name for your kid, I think you're doing them a disservice. Because I think growing up that the power of the name is something that they can integrate into their identity. And so if if your son is Richard, he can sort of read the story of Richard the Lionheart and he can take some courage from that. I actually met, in the process of this coming up with this, I actually met two people separately who were both named Dan, and they both separately, they don't know each other, told me that at troubled times in their lives, they think of the story of Daniel in the lion's den. And that's when it like clicked for me. When I heard that the second time, I thought, I can see how that makes a lot of sense. And so I think that's just my opinion, but I think that people who make up names for their kids are doing them a disservice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't help but agree. It's funny that you mentioned Michael the Archangel too, because my middle son dressed up as Saint Michael the Archangel for their All Saints Day party at school, and he was very proud of himself. Had the sword and was, I think, whacking me before they went to school. So I was the devil character. I don't know how I should feel about that, but at any rate. So on to the Battle of Civitate. I'm getting there mentally. I'm getting there. So yeah, feel free to take off from whatever position you think is best. But I think what's kind of the historical context for it? So it happened on June 18th, 1053. So who were kind of I love that Wikipedia calls them the belligerents, the two sides of this battle. But what's kind of the historical context and what led up to it, and then what ultimately happened?
Sure. So my perspective, I'm a big fan of the Normans. So that's where sort of my pseudo expertise, if you will, on the subject comes in, and the Italian Normans in particular. So the Italian Normans had come to Italy in 1017. So that's like 36 years prior, something like that. And basically they came as mercenaries, and they originally came and worked for the Lombards. So southern Italy at the time was very fractured, and it had been actually in a very sort of fractured political state for really centuries prior. There had been various Muslim incursions. The Muslims at the time that the Normans arrived had owned Sicily. They basically controlled the entire island of Sicily. The Lombards are sort of a leftover from Charlemagne's time, but they had sort of, and there obviously is the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. For the sake of this discussion, I'll refer to them as the Byzantines, because I always find it confusing referring to them as the Romans when we're talking separately about Romans in Rome. But the Byzantine Empire also controlled various fragments of southern Italy. And so you have the Lombards have some of it, the Papal States have some of it, the Byzantines have some of it, and the Muslims have Sicily. And within what the Muslims control, there's three separate factions who basically split up and decide to start fighting each other. So, and at the same time as raiding the rest of southern Italy. So it's a very fractured, contentious area at the time. And so the Normans show up as mercenaries for the Lombards, essentially. They meet this Lombard duke who had been deposed, essentially, by the Byzantines. And he says, hey, check it out. There's, the weather here is great. We have citrus fruit, Italian women. Why don't you stay and fight? And they said, well, that sounds great, but there's only a handful of us. They were coming back from a pilgrimage. And they said, we'll be back in the spring. And they were. So they came back in the spring with a bunch of them, several hundred of them. And everything went great for the first year. There was a disastrous battle the second year where all of them, but about 10 of them died. Whoa. But the Normans just didn't care, I guess, and they kept coming. And so that was the only battle actually in Italy that the Normans lost, if I recall correctly, was that battle in 1018 at the site of Cannae, which is the site of the famous Roman battle. But after that, they were basically invulnerable. You could not beat them because they had really perfected this heavy cavalry charge, which took everybody essentially by surprise. And they didn't really have a good counter for it. So they essentially, in coming as mercenaries, they became sort of the preeminent muscle of the peninsula. And they worked either for the Lombards, sometimes they worked for the Byzantines, they worked for whoever was kind of paying, and they kind of moved back and forth. And the heavy cavalry charge was so dominant, and so many more Normans kept coming, that Normans ended up being, after about 10 years, Normans were essentially like on both sides of every conflict. And so whoever won, those Normans would essentially negotiate like a good deal for the Normans who had been captured on the other side. So the Normans would always sort of like escape every battle totally fine. And, everyone else was sort of, paying the Normans and, winning or losing, I guess, depending on how fortune went. Eventually, one of the Normans received, he became landed essentially in exchange for his service. And so that was really the first big mistake that the Lombards made, was they made Rainulf the Count of Aversa. And so then he became landed and became sort of a part of the elite and sort of like an official lord of the land. And once he kind of became lord, a lord, that sort of clicked in everyone else's head. Like, wait a minute, like, if we kind of keep this up, there could be a little piece here for me as well. And so, as time goes on, that's basically what happens. Is the Normans kind of keep steamrolling, they keep doing good, they keep getting more territory, and so by the time that we're coming up to the time of Pope Leo IX, there's really there's everything is sort of very fractured in the Norman sphere. There's different groups, and they're typically like family groups, but they all kind of work together, but they're all kind of separate, if that makes sense. It's not necessarily like a unified polity by any means, but they are essentially the masters of southern Italy when it comes to muscle. And everybody knows that. They essentially beat off the Byzantines in the early 1040s. The Lombards are kind of too weak at this point. The Pope doesn't really have much muscle. He's kind of reliant on the Holy Roman Emperor. And the Holy Roman Emperor is basically busy fighting with Hungary and sort of doing other things, and he's sort of off in other places. And the Muslims in Sicily are fighting each other. So the Normans are slowly just getting the rest of the territory. Now, the Normans, these are sons of the elite. So these are knights for the most part, or soldiers. I would say there's probably some scoundrels that, come for the adventure as well, but it's a big part, certainly of the influential ones, are sons of the elite. But they are also sort of like pseudo disinherited second sons, third sons, and that sort of thing as well. So when they start getting territory and being in the area, they're there as mercenaries. They're there on an adventure. They were raiding each other's territory. They were raiding their own territories. I mean, they were not good rulers by any measure of leadership. And so the local population hated them, even if they technically were in control, but they're so good at killing people that want to fight them that you kind of don't have much of a choice, essentially. And so the Pope, once he becomes Pope, I believe his name was Bruno before he became Pope. And pretty much as soon as he becomes Pope, he's getting letters from everybody like, hey, the Normans are just ravaging our towns, and they're doing all these crazy things to people, and they're stealing people's women, doing all this stuff. They were a bunch of rowdy young men. They were kind of out of control. They were not, they weren't there to be leaders. They were there to be mercenaries and be on an adventure and stuff. And it just turned out that, like, well, this is kind of the path, and now we own this town now. I don't know. We've been raiding stuff for the last 10 years. What do we do? I don't know. Let's go raiding again. So they had some hard lessons to learn, because they did end up causing some famines. A lot of them were assassinated, and they had some real struggles with the local population. So they kind of got a little bit back in return, but they were not good leaders. So this is pretty much what really kicked off their conflict with the Pope is that really a lot of the locals in the areas were essentially writing letters to the Pope, like, please, you got to help us. This is getting out of control. Although, so the one thing though is that the Normans were never against the Pope. They were never, or I mean, they were. In fact, I would say they probably thought of themselves as good Christians.
Right.
They. So I guess I don't want to make it clear, I guess, ahead of time that they didn't have any like particular beef with the Pope, or with Christianity or anything like that. They were just, they were the rowdy young men of the time, and so the Pope, he is getting all of these complaints. And the other issue that Pope Leo was having is that he knew that the Papal States area around Benevento was kind of contested, and it was like not really clear who owned Benevento and sort of the surrounding areas. And so he obviously wanted to control it, didn't want the Normans to control it, and he wanted to get rid of the Normans, essentially. So he sort of was pretty open about it, actually, as far as like collaborating with other people. He kind of knew that he couldn't do it on his own and that no one else could kind of do it on their own. And the Holy Roman Emperor, since he didn't really have any enthusiasm for that, he wasn't going to do anything about it. In fact, 2 years before that, I believe, before he became Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor had traveled down and actually formally invested some of the Normans in their lands. So they were sort of official vassals of the Pope's muscle, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of a problem for him. But he starts writing letters all over the place. The King of France is too busy. He's actually, funnily enough, he has problems with his own Normans. It's a common theme.
Mm-hmm.
But he does get a response from the Byzantine Empire, and they basically come up with this plan in 1051, kind of late in 1051. Hey, why don't you get an army and we'll get an army and our armies will meet. And then we will come up with a final solution to the Normans, if you will. And so that was sort of the plan. And so in 1052, he's kind of like preparing all of that. He's kind of trying to get things going. 1052, he goes to spend Christmas with the Holy Roman Emperor to raise troops, essentially. And the emperor's too busy again. Henry III, I believe, he's just too busy. All that Pope Leo IX is able to get is 700 Swabian mercenaries. So that's really all he's able to sort of cobble up on this trip. Better than nothing, I suppose. And so he starts off with 1053. He starts traveling south because he's supposed to meet up with the army of the Byzantine Empire in the summer. And on his way, he's kind of raising troops and stopping in towns and stuff. And it's sort of this progression, I suppose, this 5-month progression leading up to the battle, of him sort of traveling through southern Germany and northern Italy, raising troops, trying to get his army prepared. The Normans are pretty aware of what's going on, and they realize that obviously they can't let these armies meet up. And they obviously have they're obviously very good at fighting, but their situation is pretty tenuous in a way, since they are, they're not an established population. They're sort of a hostile elite that is ruling this area. And so their situation is reasonably precarious. Like one battle lost could really be the end of them. And so they're watching the Pope march his army south, and it's pretty much like all hands on deck. Everybody who's not garrisoning a castle pretty much shows up to fight. And so, which is pretty interesting, because not only apparently this is one of the best of the time and place, one of the best well-documented battles, but also it gives us an idea of the Norman population at the time. They had about 3,500 total Normans at the battle. And the Pope ends up raising, his army as it comes south with these Swabians. He sort of raises these various contingents of kind of cavalry and soldiers and stuff. And he ends up with, I believe it's 6,000 or 6,500, almost double of what the Normans have. But the quality of troops really matters, unfortunately, for the Pope. And so the Normans are watching this happen, and they realize, they kind of don't know where the Byzantine army is, but they need to go. Once the Pope kind of gets close enough, they got to basically go intercept the Pope's army. So that's what they do. They go out there, and they essentially find the Pope camped at Civitate and his army camped outside. And so they send negotiators over, some messengers over to the Pope that is basically like, you know, you're the Pope. Like, we're good Christians. This is a little awkward, right? Like, what's going on here? Can't we get along? And the Swabian mercenaries think that they're going to just they mock the Normans, and they're very tall, and they are making comments about the Normans' height. Although I think the Normans were reasonably tall for the time and place as well, but these Swabians must have been very tall. But they were making fun of their height and making fun of them, and so the messengers basically came back to the Normans' camp, totally dejected. And the Normans were kind of also in a very difficult situation, still, even more so at that time, because they didn't want to fight the Pope, obviously. But they couldn't let the Pope's army meet up with the Byzantine army. They didn't know where the Byzantine army was. So they were kind of unclear as to how close the other army was. They weren't sure. But also on their way, essentially, once they gathered up and sort of head out, they were so unpopular with the local populations that all the local populations had shut their gates to them as they traveled through.
Oh,
so
wow.
they didn't have any supplies, essentially, by the time they show up to the battlefield. So they don't have anything to eat. So they're out there at the battlefield with no food and, trying to not fight the Pope. And, their messengers get sent back. And so they're just like, well, I guess it's just on tomorrow morning. So sure, as soon as it's daylight, basically the Normans just form up, and they're sort of lined up in their army's almost entirely cavalry because they're all knights. And so they basically line up in 3 blocks, essentially. And the Pope's army is in sort of 2 blocks. The front middle block has the Swabian mercenaries that are kind of up on a hill with some other troops. And then the other side has some kind of mixed cavalry and infantry. And it seems from the accounts that the Pope's army is very ragtag, obviously not very directly commanded, and sort of has no idea what's going on. Because as soon as it's light enough to see, the Normans on the right side. Maybe I should stop there before we get into it. If there's anything questions that you have before we talk about the battle.
No, that's all really, really interesting. It makes perfect sense. And were the Pope's armies also all cavalry, or was it quite a bit infantry? I guess if it was not seasoned soldiers, right?
Yeah, it was mostly infantry, I think, and pretty diverse. Which, when you're fighting sort of in an organized formation, is not ideal.
Right. Yeah, I can totally understand that. No, what I've been thinking about is, so what I've known about Leo IX is he was, one of the central characters of the moral reformation, if you want to call it that, of like the Cluniac reform, effectively, of Catholicism, of, Western civilization, Western Christianity, because it had fallen into such disrepair. I'm sure you know a ton of this. I think St. Gregory VII, who ended up canonizing him 30 years later, 28 years later, after he died, was, I imagine, probably just a kid when Leo IX was the actual Pope. But the two of them were central characters on the moral reform side. But I just was kind of reflecting on another Leo XIV, our current Pope, and how it's so strange to think of him commanding armies. It's so foreign to our present sensibilities, but it was just a reality that popes couldn't avoid. So some, like Julius II, were good military commanders, were jerks, and nobody liked them. But everybody's a mixed bag. But then Leo IX is kind of on the opposite end, and one wonders if it's like his history of him talks about how the Normans, like you said, were reluctant because he was their spiritual father, and here he is attacking them. So I don't really have a point to that. It's just kind of an interesting thing to kind of reflect on how, thankfully, I think, for better or for worse, the Papal States ended up going by the wayside, being repossessed, I suppose, by Mussolini et al. And then all of a sudden the Pope doesn't command any armies anymore. And maybe that's just for the best. It just took several centuries for us to get there.
Well, at the time, it was very common for higher up clergy to be essentially sons of the elite. And the elite at that time would just get a military training. So even if you were going into the clergy, you may have been raised to be a knight or to be, essentially to be in combat. And then, I switched it up and went and joined the clergy essentially. So I don't get the sense that Leo was super martial, maybe like some other popes or bishops were. But he was an aggressive guy, it seems like. And so I don't think it was I think it was pretty normal at the time. Another example I can think of, just 50 years later is Baldwin the First, the brother of Godfrey of Bouillon. Sorry, that's Baldwin the First of Jerusalem. He's typically known as Baldwin of Edessa, I guess. But he actually was set to go. He sort of received that military training and then went into the clergy. And then when the crusade was called, or maybe shortly before, kind of decided like, nah, this is not for me. I actually don't want to be in the clergy. And so he basically went back to being a knight and joined Godfrey on the crusade.
Interesting.
So there's kind of a fluidity, I maybe is the way to put it, between sort of the knightly profession and the clergy in a way, because both of those two were essentially the main career paths open to sons of the elite.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it makes perfect sense because it's similar to, I guess you could call it spiritual fatherhood and biological fatherhood. You're called to the same things. They're just manifesting in completely different ways. I mean, knighthood, you're going and out on the battlefield and defending the honor of whoever's behind you, or, but like it takes a tremendous amount of virtue to do that and do that well, and to be a priest or a bishop or a pope to do those things correctly. It takes a tremendous amount of those things too. So, I mean, yeah, it's very interesting because it wasn't a luxury. You had to learn how to fight, and then the church also needs clergy, at the same time. That's really interesting to think about too.
Yeah, I actually have a book that I am meaning to go through. It's called Medieval Churchmen in War or something like that. It's just all about these various warrior bishops that
Interesting.
That sort of what the theory behind that and how that was accepted, and some examples of these various bishops going into war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How old is it? The book?
Oh, it's pretty new.
Is
it's like 2019, I think, or 2022, somewhere in there.
Okay, interesting. You'll send me the link to that. Yeah, because I kind of want to read that now too.
Yeah. All right. So I guess back to the battle.
Yeah.
Okay. So as soon as daylight is there, the Normans are formed up, and the Pope's army knew that it was coming. So they were kind of getting formed up, I suppose, if not formed up. But the Normans on the right were commanded by Richard of Aversa, who's the nephew of the aforementioned Rainulf. And they basically just ride across the field at this sort of second block of the Pope's army. As soon as they can see in front of them, they just ride across the field at these guys. And they cut through them like butter, basically, drive them right from the field almost immediately. That whole side of the Pope's army, either it melts or these guys are just running as far as they can. And so Richard and his knights are basically just pursuing these guys, at the crack of daylight, pursuing half of the Pope's army off of the field. Humphrey of Hauteville, he's sort of the preeminent Norman, or I'm sorry. Yeah, it is Humphrey. Humphrey of Hauteville is, he's sort of the preeminent Norman lord in the area, and he's commanding the center. And then he's got his half-brother, Robert, who's also known as Robert Guiscard, commanding on the left, those guys on the left. And so Humphrey basically tells Robert to just hold up, I'll take care of these guys in the middle. You just wait in reserve and, we'll see how it goes. The Swabian mercenaries in the middle were pretty tough. They weren't sort of falling for the heavy cavalry charge of the Normans. And so Humphrey really got bogged down in the middle. And Robert saw him get bogged down in the middle. So he rides out and tries to ride also into the Swabians, and he also gets bogged down. And it was basically just thick fighting until Richard basically he drove those guys way off of the field as far as they could sort of easily cut people down, and then just he rode back in and he jumped into the middle, and then basically the Swabians they refused to surrender, so they fought down to the last man.
Wow.
And after that, the Pope was actually watching from the walls of the city. And so, he's standing there watching as his army gets cut down, 100 guys left, 50 guys left, a couple guys left, everybody's dead. And the leaders of the city, basically at that point, they take the Pope and walk him to the gate and push him outside because they don't want anything to do with the Normans. They don't want to have any problems with the Normans thinking that maybe they're trying to shelter the Pope, or that, now the Normans should come get the Pope. And they don't want there to be any doubt that they're against the Normans, or that they don't want to be perceived as being against the Normans. So immediately as it's over, they walk the Pope out the gate of the city. And so the Normans, I mean, they very respectfully, fall on their knees before the Pope. And I don't know, I guess if they apologized, but they had nothing but nice words to say to him. And he's not exactly a prisoner. He's not exactly not a prisoner at this point, if you know what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. So he was allowed to write letters, and he wrote a lot of letters, apparently, to everybody who he could think to write a letter to send an army to his rescue and come crush the Normans. But that he was not persuasive. He was at least not more persuasive than Norman Steele. Mm-hmm. And so basically the Normans escorted him from Civitate back to Benevento, and he sat in house arrest, I suppose maybe you could call it. Although, he wasn't wanting for any he had any food, wine, as many pens and paper as he could want, but he was not allowed to leave until him and Humphrey essentially came to an agreement on Humphrey essentially being properly invested in his lands and the Pope not trying to kill him. That was there. We don't have a record of the agreement, but that seems to essentially be the agreement. And this was actually, I mean, I guess we can sort of go into the implications of this if you'd like.
Sure, yeah.
But it was pretty. Some of the implications of this are pretty interesting, I think. Into the present. One is that, so this starts prior to this for centuries, I believe. I mean, back into the time of Charlemagne, the Pope was essentially reliant on the Holy Roman Emperor for his muscle, basically, right, to enforce his papal rights. After this, that sort of breaks that it breaks the guarantee of that alliance essentially, to where several popes later, which I believe actually it is Gregory the Seventh.
Yep.
Is that
famous walk to Canossa with Henry IV?
Yeah. So that's Hildebrand, right?
Yep, it is. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So he is actually involved in this because he's involved. He's actually in heading to Constantinople at this time.
That's right. Okay.
And so he's busy causing the schism.
Right. Oh gosh, I forgot about that. Yeah, that's right. That's the same time.
Yeah. So
more like presiding over the death of it. It was like a long time in the making, if I remember correctly.
It seems, I mean, I don't know, maybe there's an inevitability about it, or, not necessarily about that time and place, but that there was going to be some sort of large dispute between the two factions.
He could be a ready, fire, aim kind of guy, to be fair. He got him in hot water a couple times.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. He seems like that. And so he's sort of off doing that after. So Pope Leo IX spends 9 months in house arrest before he finally agrees with the Normans, like, okay, I'm not going to kill you. And so Humphrey rides him back to Rome. He's kind of getting sicker along the way, if not sicker at the end of his kind of captivity. And he dies within a month of being back in Rome. At that same time, that's when Hildebrand is in Constantinople arguing with the Patriarch, and they both excommunicate each other and all that. But Pope Leo had actually just died. So it's sort of a strange situation, I guess, with these guys in Constantinople sort of acting on behalf of the Pope who is no longer alive.
Right.
But one of the big things is that it ends this papal reliance on the Holy Roman Empire. And so then later, I misspoke. It's actually not Gregory. It was Nicholas, I believe. Pope Nicholas
the second.
Wow. Now I'm confusing myself. Nicholas or Alexander. One of those, I forget.
It was, it was Nicholas II.
Okay, Nicholas II. Okay, yeah. So Nicholas II, and then there was, at the same time, if I recall, Benedict X is the anti-pope.
Yes.
And so Hildebrand was really the architect. Cardinal Hildebrand was really the architect at that point of essentially going and getting the Normans to come and install Nicholas II. And so, and that was all sort of downstream of this victory at Civitate. And so there's that. And then obviously when, I believe it's when Nicholas is the second is the Pope, they come up with the new rules just shortly after the Normans come and install him. They come up with the new rules of papal elections, which, if I recall, is still the same rules of elections today, right?
It's pretty close. Actually, yeah, surprisingly, it's pretty close. There's been tweaks here and there just because of the sheer number of cardinals, and people aren't trying to kill half the cardinals anymore as they were in prior centuries. But yeah, fundamentally, it's the conclave process started in 1059. You're right.
Yep. And so that's all downstream of this Norman victory at Civitate.
That's fascinating. So I've known about these things, they were, pulled the thread all the way through them, I suppose. Yeah. Anyways. Yeah. Continue, please.
Oh, well, those are, I suppose, the two big implications. I think.
Okay. Gotcha. Yeah. Interesting. Cause the Holy Roman Empire was around for how much longer? Cause Charlemagne was 100 years prior to that, almost 150 years prior to that. Or no, 250. 250, that's right. A different Leo, obviously Leo III. But so how much longer was it around and influential after that point?
Oh, for a long time. I mean, it goes well into I think as far as being influential, I think well into the 17th century at least.
That's fair, yeah.
That's like past my sort of time of expertise, but certainly well into the 16th century, the Holy Roman Empire is alive and well and kicking.
Yeah.
So
I guess it just kind of had different shape-shifting forms throughout the centuries, though, right? As far as what that influence actually looked like, right?
Well, and the other thing too is that only briefly, I think, in maybe in brief time and places, medieval history, I think what we're most familiar with is English medieval history, and England doesn't have too many interactions with the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire is a lot more concerned with either Italy or the Ottomans, things to the east, Venice, things like that, sort of as the medieval period is going on. So with a focus on sort of Anglo medieval history, the Holy Roman Empire doesn't really come into play too often.
Sure. So what are your thoughts on why Leo died so soon after he got back to Rome?
It's pretty tough to say. It doesn't seem like there's any real foul play, and that's a pretty tough year that he just had.
Yeah, because he was only 51, and I guess it's the 1000s, granted, but you would think with how well he was supposedly treated, we have no reason to doubt that. But yeah, one wonders if it's a certain sense of despair or failure or something like that, or if he just was in ill health. Who knows?
I think, I wouldn't say that I think uh, everybody sort of has, as you get older, maybe you feel, you understand maybe a little bit like the perspective on those types of things where like your own life can feel a particular way, even if maybe it wouldn't be viewed that way from the outside. So I don't know if I would say necessarily that I feel like he was failing a lot necessarily. I mean, he obviously lost the battle.
Mhm.
Everybody that fought the Normans lost, basically. But I don't know how much of a failure it seems like he really was, because, like you said, he was involved with these various other reforms. He was kind of doing some other things that seemed like they were, he sort of internationalized the papacy more so than any other pope. And that seems like that was pretty good and successful. So he had some other things going on, but if his big um, passion in life was coming up with a final solution to the Norman question, as it were, then maybe he felt like he was a big failure and he was in quite a lot of despair. I don't really know. I don't know if there's no real evidence that I can draw upon, and I don't get any particular read anyway, I guess, in my reading.
Mhm. Interesting. I was just kind of reminded of the story of Gregory the Great as another character who was forced into this civil service when he just wanted to be a monk and pray and be with his, brother monks and live a life of solitude and read and write um but he was forced to be Roman patrician or whatever, or I forget the administrator of the city of the city of Rome. That he was basically carried off to St. Peter's to be the Pope, and he hates every second of it, but is willing to undertake it because it's what the Lord's calling him to, and all these things. But then you read the biography of Gregory the Great, and the closer that he gets to death, he was always a sickly guy. I don't know if Leo the Ninth was a sickly guy or not, but probably not if he was, capable of commanding armies. But Gregory was just had this kind of inner turmoil. He's like, I long for eternity to be gone from this, so I don't have to make these choices anymore to decide between, the ways of man, which are messy and awful and rife with intrigue and all these things. And I almost wonder if it was something in the same thing. So he clearly was a very virtuous, very holy guy who loved doing all the, like, I think he was even very musical, was moved to tears a lot. I remember reading about, but there's just kind of necessary evil of commanding armies and then also having to attack his own people who loved him objectively. You wonder if he just, died of a broken heart or something.
Could very well have been, yeah.
Yeah. So what are some of the other implications from the Normans after Civitate? I know you talked about, ultimately 5 years later, they um, are able to more or less place a pope on the throne, but what are kind of some of the other implications? Where did they continue out to from there?
Well, that's one of the reasons I find the Norman story so fascinating, because they just punched way above their weight. They really, the 11th century is really like the Norman century, in my opinion. And you could kind of say, I mean, their influence, I suppose, relatively sort of wanes in the 12th century, but they still are pretty prominent. But so the Normans in Italy, they eventually coalesce the entire, it takes them until 1091 to conquer all of Sicily. It's really a manpower issue because they were getting quite a bit of young men coming over from Normandy to Italy until 1066, when William the Conqueror conquers England. And then there's tons of land and opportunity for ambitious young men. So I think the flow of young men to Italy pretty much stops at that point. And so they kind of have manpower issues, essentially. And they do end up being able to conquer the rest of Italy and Sicily. And that ends up coalescing into the Kingdom of Sicily. which takes until about 1230 to fully coalesce into the Kingdom of Sicily. So it takes them roughly 40 years from Civitate to conquer it all, to own it all, essentially. And then it takes another 40 years for that to coalesce into the Kingdom of Sicily. But the Normans in Italy were very prominent crusaders. Bohemond of Taranto, who's the son of Robert Guiscard, is really pivotal in the First Crusade. And obviously, the implications of the First Crusade are pretty enormous. And if anybody, Bohemond really put the crusade on his back through Antioch and got the Crusaders through. So it's kind of hard to imagine the First Crusade succeeding without him and his cousin Tancred. So the two of them in particular were very pivotal. Robert Curthose, the Duke of Normandy, also came. He was Norman as well. And I mean, you could say, I think it's fair to say that his contribution was worthy and notable and admirable as well, although he's perhaps not as individually as prominent and notable as Bohemond or Tancred. But the Normans really, I mean, certainly between the three of them, you can't imagine the First Crusade succeeding at all. So, and then, the implications of the crusading movement, obviously that goes on for hundreds of years, creates the Crusader states, Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Norman impact. So there is a good book on the Normans by Lars Brownworth. And it's so that a lot of people have written books on the Normans, and I've read a lot of them. And so Brownworth's book is good. I'm not saying it's ahistorical. He's a little bit looser with the facts per se. It's not I'm not saying it's ahistorical, but there's some gray area in the history. But part of that gray area is, in a way, how his book sort of shines, if you will. And one of the things that I really liked from his book was how he said that the Normans, and not just in Italy, but sort of as a whole, really coalesced Western civilization from its sort of disparate pieces coming out of what we may think of as colloquially as the Dark Ages. Mm-hmm. That sort of that Norman century, if you will, sort of coalesced everything from essentially becoming prominent in France and the way that they influenced France, conquering England, being prominent crusaders, conquering the southern part of Italy, and obviously, through Norman architecture, which really they sort of pioneered a lot of that. They pioneered a lot of castle building. They were very prominent castle builders. They were very prominent with architecture, cathedrals. They were big at pushing sort of into the Gothic style, which is really what we think of as a prominent medieval style. And a lot of their the results of sort of their conquests. I mean, St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, is from Sicily, I believe, or southern Italy. Mm-hmm. I forget exactly where, but he's from somewhere down there. So, he's sort of somebody who comes out of the Norman milieu, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Man, it's incredible. I've been studying the papacy for 10 years almost now, and Christian history for a little bit longer than that, I would say. And I've always been, I've said a couple times already, Leo the Ninth is one of my favorites. Gregory the Seventh is one of my favorites. I've always been kind of fascinated by this, Cluniac reform, because it seems so similar to right now. How it's just like this kind of laxity in morals. It's kind of Catholic inside baseball a little bit, but like the last 60, 70 years have really showed just like kind of this drop off in attendance and the number of children that Catholic families are having, and like morals among the clergy, and like all these sorts of things. And it's now kind of starting to spark this new renewal. There's lots of prominent conversions to Catholicism, for instance, like this. I think people drawn to it for similar reasons, like you're talking about with people being drawn to being knights. It's like this call to virtue, this call to something greater than what the culture is offering right now. And so it's so fascinating to think how the 11th century, and then here we are in the 21st century, 1,000 years later, the 11th century starts with the pornocracy, as it's called, the low point of the papacy, where like Rome is just run by this one corrupt family, and John the 12th famously killed by the husband of the lover who he was caught in bed with, right, thrown out a window or whatever. And then all of a sudden, here come these great moral reforms, and then here comes Leo the Ninth, and I would consider it providential that he loses at the Battle of Civitate as one little piece in this spreading of the Normans who were Christians, who were, fighting the Muslims, all these things, leading to ultimately, well, I mean, the conclave as one small little thing, but ultimately to the crusade to go reconquer the Holy Land. And then all these other things, like you said, coalescing Western civilization, kind of almost advancing it in a way that it wouldn't have been able to happen otherwise. It's hard to see that happening accidentally, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But it's again, fascinating to kind of run a thread through all those things, and see parallels to where we are now.
I actually hadn't considered until you just said what might have happened if the Normans had lost. That's how deep in the Norman sauce I am. I just can't even imagine them losing.
Nobody
I
beats the Normans.
hadn't considered what would have happened if the Normans had lost at Civitate, but it could have been a crazy political milieu there for another 100 years, 200 years, or some sort of fractured state. Obviously, the popes would be different because the Normans were very influential in. Actually, Urban II was a big friend of the Normans, as he was essentially became pope and trying to secure his position in Rome. He spent a lot of time with Roger down in Sicily and with Roger Borsa and Bohemond in the mainland. So, Urban II, obviously Nicholas II, obviously, I suppose maybe the early death of Leo the Ninth. So a lot of things would have been extremely different if the Battle of Civitate had turned a different way.
Yeah, how interesting. There was also one other kind of completely random thing that I just remembered. There is I think it was the same stretch of popes. Maybe not. Nope, it was the end of the 11th, early 12th century. There's like 8 popes in a row who were all the second. And it actually started with Urban II, and then it goes all the way through to Lucius II. Yeah, it was 8 popes in a row. And then Eugene III breaks the streak. Anyways, that's neither here nor there. But I would love to have another lengthy conversation with you on the First Crusade, because I think there's lots of threads to pull on there. And I mean, I'm super intrigued to learn more about the Normans too. Again, I'm just a lowly papal history nerd over here, but so when there's 2,000 years, it's hard to kind of hone in on one. But the Normans definitely sound like they're worth honing in on. So maybe last thing before you can share where people can find you, what would you say are 2 or 3 more books on the Normans that you'd recommend that people read to kind of get a sense?
So if people want to watch or listen to something, I actually collaborated with a great history YouTuber to create, I believe it's 4.5 hours, a documentary on the Normans, essentially. I wrote 2 of the 4 scripts. It's like kind of in 4 pieces. And so I wrote the part on the Italian Normans and the crusading Normans. But he also covered the origin of the Normans in Normandy and then William the Conqueror.
Okay.
So a couple books that I would recommend if you want to read about the Normans in Italy. John Julius Norwich's Normans in the South is a fantastic book. Highly recommend. And if you want just an overview of the Normans, that Lars Brownworth book is good, but also Levi Roach's Empire of the Normans is really good. That's sort of a much more, not much more, but it's sort of, I mean, he's very much a historian. So it's sort of a comprehensive history, if you will. Whereas Lars Brownworth, I don't think he's a historian, which I'm not a historian, so I'm not saying that slanderously. But I think he's more of I don't know. I think he's not a historian, let's say. He's like me, a little more swashbuckling, perhaps, with the facts.
Yeah, that was the word that was coming to mind. Yeah. You said he was kind of more of a was that the one more of a popular telling, a little looser with the facts per se?
a little looser per se. I mean, one of the things that really irked me, and I'm sorry, Lars, if you're listening, one of the things that really irked me, he has a little bit of a cynical take on Bohemond, and I don't think that's really fair. So that kind of irked me a little bit.
Okay, well, I mean, I'd be interested to know if Lars was listening. That'd be a win in my book, one way or the other. But excellent. Well, yeah, I mean, been going for almost an hour, so we can probably close it up there. Yeah, thanks for telling that story and kind of going back down or back in history. It'll be 1,000 years in 29 more years. 1053, 28 more years. That's wild. Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, I found this incredibly edifying, so I'm sure the listeners will as well. So where can people find you? Anything you'd like to promote?
Oh yeah. Well, thanks for having me on. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and I'm sure we'll do, on yours or mine, we'll do some more. So you can find me at Memory Medieval on Substack and on Twitter or X. And I have all kinds of projects coming up in 2026, relative to medieval history. So I'm going to be putting out some custom medieval history playing cards and possibly running actually like a curated little trip to Italy, actually, to visit some Norman castles and things like that for some people that want to come along for a little trip and go check out all the sites. And I don't know if a big podcast on the Normans is coming up next year or in the future after that, but I definitely, I can't get enough of the Normans. So there's going to be sort of always more Norman content.
Yes, good. Can't get enough. Yeah, I didn't know anything. I didn't know that there were Italian Normans. I knew that there were Normans. I didn't know that there were French and Italian, and then William the Conqueror. Does he qualify as an English Norman technically then? Right. So
I believe his descendants are referred to as Anglo-Normans. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No, I mean, there's plenty of depths to plumb there for sure. So, well, thanks again, Michael. This has been a pleasure for me too. Looking forward to having you on again, and hopefully appearing on yours. Maybe as a teaser sometime next year. But dueling, I'm personally excited about that. Maybe more of the Catholic moral qualms or lack thereof about dueling. So I'm pretty excited for that. But
yeah, looking forward to it.
Yeah. Until then, good to talk to you, and we'll talk to you again soon.